Paul Courant will round out today's plenary, and Paul is University of Michigan librarian and Dean of Libraries, as well as Arthur F. Thurneau Professor, Harold T. Shapiro Collegiate Professor of Public Policy, Professor of Economics, Professor of Information, and Faculty Associate in the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. And he has the wonderful title of Digital Preservation, A Different Animal in Surprising Ways. So all the speakers will talk, and we'll leave time at the end of their 30, after the 20 or so minutes for questions. And then if we have time at the very end of the session, we'll take some more closing questions and comments. So please join me in welcoming Ken Hamma.
Great. Both places at the same time. Good morning. Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Tim and Patrick and the program committee for inviting me to my first meeting of the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections. You'll see that I have my thing entirely written out. I have to do this because I'm dyslexic. I don't normally mention that, except that you have SPNHC and pronounce it spinach. That really appeals in a very deep way. Thinking about what I was going to say this morning and the context in which I'm saying it was a good opportunity for me to think again about things that I knew or thought I knew, things that are pretty fundamental and that we keep coming back to. So I think I should start with the obvious. Meg's already mentioned it. None of the three of us speaking here this morning in this session has anything to do with the profession of any of the professions in the domain of natural history. Dominic is the only true techie guy among us, and you'll notice that when he talks. But he's someone who I've learned over the last few years who has an understanding of the potential for digitized collections in the framework of collaborative research that far surpasses that of many who speak about it most. And Paul I've known for a while. He's an economist, but also a provost, a university librarian. But in my mind, he's a humanist that has an understanding of the things that we do and brings to bear on them an economic analysis, adding insights of extraordinary clarity that really would have never occurred to me. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should admit that I'm a lapsed classical archaeologist, perhaps because of having initially chosen that profession, what we used to refer to as the profession of the past. I had the least onerous task this morning of simply teeing up the topics of access and preservation of digital resources and setting the stage for this session and for the discussion that will follow. In the interest of that discussion, I intend to be brief this morning. Given that we were invited here despite our diversity, I understand we are probably meant to be provocative rather than pedagogical. None of us have anything to teach any of you about anything in natural history. Paul and Dominic may have a different take on that, but they'll let us know when they get to the stage. They happen to be people I have worked with or shared a stage with and whose work I have followed closely. So I think I can safely say that we do likely agree that this is not fundamentally about collections in museums and libraries, nor is it fundamentally about technology. In the end, it is about what it has always been about, understanding the world that we live in. And I think it's good that we periodically remind ourselves of that. Among ourselves, we frequently use shorthand, and it's been done this morning already a number of times, like digitization, to describe a scope of activity that we assume everyone understands. I was listening this morning and I heard also in the question period, digitization used 4 or 5 times, each time with an implicit different scope. I think we need to be careful of that because it's clear that words matter, both among us, but especially when the big picture guys hear digitization and tend to think optional, inexpensive, we'll do that later. That happened here at Yale a couple of years ago when someone asked the president of the university, Richard Levin, in a kind of town hall meeting that the president here hosts twice a year, where digitization fell among the university's priorities. You could have heard a pin drop. Clearly, instead of standing up there, what digitization? Ambushed by the digitization question. While providing online access to all of Yale's collections is very high on his list, digitization, not so much, at least as he understood it at that moment. I know from experience that we all come to access and preservation in the management of collections from different tangents. And so a discussion of basic principles is often a useful way of level setting the conversation with agreed terms. One way of approaching our digital work is with the concept of the digital content lifecycle. This is commonly shared, I think, and to a great extent common across knowledge domains, so I assume it will be familiar to almost everyone here. It isn't particularly difficult to grasp. I don't have a pointer, so I'll just moving from basically from left to right around this. How a diagram like this can be useful in planning, not only getting going, but also in long-term planning, in estimating staff, financial, and technical resources that will be required, not just to get started, which is often all we think about in projects, but also to maintain an environment for digital collections management and access over time. So at the beginning, moving to a digital environment or initiation of a more limited project one normally starts at over here at where this blue box called selecting. You're either selecting a subset of specimens for a project or selecting a prioritized subset of a collection for general collections documentation. Selecting, though, takes on a whole new meaning when the object being selected is a born digital work that is actually selected when it comes into the collection. I can imagine that some of you may manage such assets, born digital works, even though being born and being digital are a little difficult to square in the natural world as we traditionally know it. But we might come back to that in discussion, because I think managing digital objects themselves, as if they were specimens in a collection, has a priority different from managing digital assets as we think of them. Most of us have found ourselves probably at one time or another in these projects with more of one of these than the other. More describing, that is more metadata, or more creating, that is more creating the assets, whether those are images or other digital assets. Usually we have more of the describing, simply because we've been cataloging our collections much longer than we've been doing imaging. But I've also seen many a project finish up with a virtual shoebox of digital images without any of the metadata that might make them useful or even findable. Wait until that project manager retires, and you will likely need one of these. In the probably in the decade 1998 to 2008 or so, art museums, and it may be similar in the world of natural history, went through a period in which federal funding agencies in this country were so eager to help with what they called digitization, but was really merely creating digital surrogates. Once successfully captured and annotated, we move along this activity flow from left to right to managing those viable digital materials over time, to preserving all of them or preserving some of them that rise to the bar of long-term preservation, and it's always interesting to know how people set that and where they set it. And finally then to pushing them along to discovery online or discovery locally and reuse. In reality, things usually get published before we tackle the hard topic of preservation, but still, forcing ourselves to imagine and plan this sequence from the outset helps us be clear, I think, about the scope of activities and the resources that will be required to make being digital in collections management useful, efficient, and sustainable. So that was my task, but I began looking around and I found that there are literally hundreds of these digital lifecycle diagrams, and you probably have one that you prefer or even one that you've made up and use at home. There are lots to choose from, each adding a flavor of management that corresponds often to specific goals. Peer review, in this one, for example, suggests it may be responding to a model for managing assets in academic publishing, or something closely allied to that. The additional layers, sometimes to the point of illegibility, and this happens, I think, way too often, The addition of layers here suggests to me perhaps an oversight or funding office, like the Provost Office or the XYZ Foundation, has required ever more explanation in iterations of a funding request from one meeting to another, and has wound up with a cycle that essentially isn't a cycle but encompasses almost everything you might be doing in your office. Other diagrams revert to the basic elements of the life cycle, and I think this is actually a much more interesting way to go because they add critical aspects of the digital ecosystem that we live in that are important but not inherently part of the life cycle of digital assets, such as policy and governance, and shared community resources like standards, data structures, and data exchange protocols. The value of having a structural view of managing digital assets is confirmed even by the tweeting set in the adoption of essentially similar schemes for online syndication and social media, like this one. Even though the graphic is meant for the 140-character attention span, it is not that much different from what we are accustomed to, I think, in our professional experience for our still images and 3D models that we manage. Interestingly, though, in this diagram, there is no hint of preservation, probably for good reasons of which I can think of several. Think Anthony Weiner, for example. It's even more instructive, I think, to go back 10 years or 15 years and to look at early attempts to illustrate what we have come to know as the digital life cycle, not known as that then. A diagram like this now seems quaint, if not occasionally misdirected. Here on my side, on your left, is a floating little circle called derived media. It's completely opaque to me what that might be, and it's standing near something called interactive perception. It's hard to know how perception might be otherwise, but there seems to be a lot of room for misunderstanding, I think, in a diagram like this. But if any of you are old enough to have been active in this business 15 years ago and 20 years ago, you'll recognize that this probably is a good reflection of the reality that we were in at that time. Current illustrations, though, are pretty universally focused on these four topics: create, manage, distribute, and archive. Okay, there's a point in driving that into the ground, because I think we look at this and we think that we've somehow captured something, and I think we probably have, but with all the clarity of understanding and experience that is embedded here and really pretty finely honed to these easily grasped diagrams, why I wonder to myself, are we still coming up short with preservation and access? Paul and Dominic, in their talks that will follow, may argue that we're not, but my sense is very much that we are. And by we, I mean not just collection managers, not just the museums in which those collections exist, but the research and creative communities that we are a part of and that are our reasons for being. I suspect that natural history fields may be doing better than art history and archaeology, which are the fields that I know best. But for those fields, the Crest Foundation released a report just last week that still points unequivocally to lack of access to reasonably good digital resources in reasonably easy ways, and to the impermanence of digital resources and scholarly outputs as the key perceived barriers among professionals in the field. I saw an early draft of that Crest report the same week that Tim sent me the email asking if I would consider speaking here this morning. And my first thought was, and still is, what aren't we clear on in the parts of this schedule that include access and preservation? I had a different take on that sitting in the town hall meeting where a staff member asked the president about digitization. My suspicion is that we use the terms access and preservation in the same way we sometimes use digitization. That is, as shorthand for something we think we know and understand, and as something we think we have fully agreed concepts for. What we really require, however, is what President Levin required from his questionnaire on digitization: more thought, more thoughtful formulations, and periodically probably a full rethink. But I'll leave those topics to Paul and Dominic. After a couple of decades in this business, I've come to think there is something else going on here also, and that there are two basic operating issues or modes of thinking that become impediments, and that without really recognizing them and coming to terms with them can begin to hobble and disable operations. Whoops. One is thinking is incremental. It looks different on this screen than it does anywhere else. And the second is implementation may be problematic. Thinking is incremental. As Albert Einstein stated, problems that are created by our current level of thinking can't be solved by that same level of thinking. In implementing digital technologies, however, often for the first time, if you've been around long enough to do that, or migrating to new paradigms in our business, and thus fundamentally changing those businesses, you might ask, how could thinking be other than incremental? We move from what we know to what we don't know. I remember, for example, my best visual of this, how long the card catalog, that is a big thing that's usually brown with little trays with cards in it, at the Bancroft Library at Berkeley, stood silently ignored as nearly everyone adopted the online public access catalog. But you knew there was somebody sitting in an office in that library someplace saying, I know it's not going to work, I know it's not going to work, and we're just going to save this card catalog. Sometimes not thinking incrementally, however, and jumping to the next best thing can be misguided. But just as often, it is not. So my takeaway, better to be willing to be risk takers now and then, and at the same time, be willing to accept the consequences than not. I've been involved with a number of risky projects, one of which really has become famous in the art museum world as a cautionary tale, and it comes up at almost every meeting of people who deal with computers in art museums, but also with projects that I think have fundamentally changed the environment, other risky projects. Among the latter was Yale's recent change of policy on public domain works in its collections, moving all cataloging, and being clear about this, not just sort of thinking we're going to do this, but saying in policy for the university, all cataloging and all digital surrogates, even of the very best quality, into the public domain. That means no fees, no gatekeeping, no forms to fill out, no lawyering up just to use an image in the classroom. The team effort that achieved this involved library, archival, and museum collections across campus, and Meg's office, very importantly, Meg's Office of Digital Assets and Infrastructure. And I think the exercise, thinking through what it takes to fundamentally change something that has been taken for granted for a better part of a century, the exercise of doing that was as valuable for Yale as the outcome itself. The end result, of course, responds like magic, as expected, to the fluid nature of the network, and will do even more so when our data is as accessible to machines as easily as it is to humans. One implementation of this policy is this on the website of the Yale Center for British Art, and it functions very well for research. You simply go to the website, you click on the little download, I don't know if you can see there below the current image that's showing, brings up a little box and says, what do you want? And if you ask us, we'll give you the biggest fat file that we've got, up to 500 megabytes. But given the impediment of the size of the pipe that usually runs from one place to another, we decided on smaller sizes to start with, but sizes that are perfectly acceptable for full-page publication. By contrast, except for a few followers like the National Gallery of Art in Washington, art museums are stuck in the same incremental thought patterns that have held them hostage for over a century in a conflict between mission and generally discountable little revenue streams from licensing images. Those thought patterns become all the more pernicious in the online world, in particular as we begin implementing Web 3.0 technologies. Implementation may be problematic. Implementation may be problematic. This, by the way, is the entire quote, the full response of a U.S. State Department official in March when asked about the future of training Afghan security forces. Although not quite so fraught, because we're not there, we're in our basements usually, managing collections. Similar situations can and do occur for us when we have somehow made the environment toxic to the proposed solution. This is almost, if you're in the middle of it, this is almost impossible to recognize. It seems as though no one understands what you're saying. Maybe key participants aren't on board to begin with. Maybe the mission isn't fully defined with clear and measurable outcomes. Maybe going in we didn't think of or even realize all the issues in the right order. Maybe a good solution for the collection is really an unwanted outcome for the business or risk management office. Getting into this kind of fix is much easier to do than to undo. There's another diagram, and I borrowed this from Meg's office, that we use at Yale to help, in addition to the digital asset lifecycle, to help people think about the complexity of even some of the small things that they decide to do or changes that they decide to make in managing collections. It's relatively easy to pave the way for better outcomes with technology implementation when you consider the entire community, and a community that includes not just technology, but people, and the content and the shared policy and practice that you need. If one can agree on data and application standards, if one can come to terms with shared policies, which is very difficult but extremely rewarding to do, and being sure to include administrators who may seem extraneous and general counsel when appropriate into those discussions, and to engage your community or communities. And by that I mean not just other people who manage natural history collections, but researchers, anyone you can imagine being part of a research or a creative community that you could touch or would want to touch. I think the more persistent we all are at cultivating and recultivating this kind of ecosystem, the richer and more sustainable the outcome is for all of us. We used to worry a lot about the change and the pace of change with technology. I think because of agreement about some of the things that I've mentioned this morning, that worry is less so today. And with respect to managing data and data exchange, we have good reason to be optimistic. Even with paradigm shifts we can see coming at us with semantic web technologies, we can lay out migration paths based on the solid foundation we've all contributed to. These are the very moments, however, at which the last two habits I've mentioned, those of incremental thinking and less than thoughtful implementation, will almost certainly hurt even more than they have in the past. Thank you. I meant to take questions if there are any. Right? Right. Nobody has born digital assets and no born digital tapeworms in their collection. Oh, okay, so we're just going to go from one to another. I thought Meg might have something to say. Okay, next is Dominic Goldman from the British Museum. I don't know. Oh, here.
Hi, my name is Dominic Goldman from the British Museum, and as Meg said, I run a project called Research Space, which is a semantic web project, a collaborative online research environment, which we're developing at the moment. I've got this slide, which has an interesting story attached to it. Ken actually had it in his presentation because I gave it to him a few weeks ago, or a couple of months ago. And he's kindly taken it out of his presentation. But I was talking to someone this morning and they said it's done the rounds as well. So I don't know if anybody's seen this picture before, but it is the vision of collaborative research with the British Museum and the Library of Congress from 1962. So it's 50 years, 50th anniversary of this vision. And we still haven't been able to make this happen. although you can see there, if I point to it, the interesting thing is that they're still using pen and paper to record all the results, even though they've got all of this tech around it. And that is actually correct, because we've never been able to create a paperless office, so that is the correct part of that slide. So my presentation, actually I haven't got an argument particularly. I have a lecture, I attend King's College London at the moment, and I have a lecture called Willard McCarthy. And he says it's not about what's new, it's about what's going on. And I think the presentation is a little bit about what's going on in this arena. So in a nutshell, I'm talking about technology allowing greater cooperation and collaboration and blurring the boundaries between these concepts in a way that you couldn't do when you were collaborating and cooperating on an individual basis without technology. I'm also talking about more open data that helps us answer bigger questions. So this is the Tim Berners-Lee call to say we need more data to be able to answer these bigger questions and bring it all together. I'm also suggesting that many of us haven't engaged with this at all, and we need to start engaging. We need to lift our heads out and to see what's going on. And I'm also, because of the research base, because it's a semantic web project, I'm talking about linked data and semantic web and the potential to allow us to pursue research agendas more efficiently, effectively, and sustainably. I would say, though, that this part of the presentation is a little bit negative, but it gets positive later on. And so I've got a number of problems to get to that vision of 1962. We have to overcome quite a few problems. On the left, you can see a slide that I've actually pinched from Jürgen Renn of the Max Planck Institute, and he's been using this slide since 2006. He used it at the British Museum at a talk he did, and I suspect he still feels that it's true, and it's extremely negative. So lack of content, lack of infrastructure, uncertain future of the web, lack of open access, lots of lacks of. But what you don't know is behind that he had some other notes with other issues about collaboration and culture on the web, issues of commercial interest, lack of funds for creation and maintenance of infrastructure, lack of coordination between initiatives, fragmentation of responsibility between organizations, lack of awareness of scholars, treasure house mentality of museums and archives, and a whole host of other legal issues. So that is quite a pessimistic view, although obviously I'm involved in a project that's trying to put some of those things right. So I can only talk about the British Museum. You'll be able to think about what the situation is in your own organisations. But in the British Museum, we have no specific infrastructure for our researchers. Our researchers beg, borrow, and steal from other organisations in order to do their projects. Our IT budgets are fairly small and mostly go on the operation and business side of the museum. So we don't support our researchers very well. A lot of you will also know that we've just had a 15% cut in our budgets, which means that there are lots of debates around the open access issue and nervousness about going open access, although as I've said there, one of the secrets of Google's success is being able to offer these free services, and being able to compete with that is quite difficult. Which means that we haven't really created a vision of friction-free networks. And we're competing on restriction. We're competing on restriction rather than innovation and creativity, and I think that's a real problem for our researchers. That's not to say that we don't try and do massive, complicated projects with the infrastructure that we've got. We do, and this is a slide showing the partners in one British Museum project. I'm not sure exactly how many there are, but they're trying to collect, the British Museum is trying to collect object data about objects at an ancient Greek site in Egypt. And if you went anywhere else and showed that picture, they'd say, wow, that's a really complicated, difficult project, spread over lots of organizations. Bringing that together, bringing that data together and doing something coherent with it would be very difficult. And actually, it's been run by one person on a shoestring. So you won't be surprised to know that it's in its 8th year and still running, and I suspect you know of projects that are very similar to that. So about a year ago, we actually looked at some of the museum projects and took some statistics. And you can see that they are, on the face of it, again, quite complicated. So project team size, a third of our projects are more than 20 people. I mean, we don't have a team of 20 people on some of our really big IT projects. So these are big projects and spread over many organizations. Project length, over 5 years. 50% of these projects are over 5 years, and many of them go on much longer than that. And one of the reasons for that might be because if you look at the mode of communication statistics, they're all being run using email and telephone. Very little use of the internet, and as I said before, where we are using the internet, we're often using infrastructure that's borrowed from other people. So what's happening out there now is that because we as institutions are not dealing with this issue, we're not producing the infrastructure, we're not investing in it, others are trying to do it for us. And these are the aggregators, and they include Google, of course, Europeana, which is partnered up with the Digital Public Library of America, and the BBC have also put their hat in the ring as well for an aggregation environment. I'll read the first one. So the Google Cultural Institute, I don't know if you've heard of that set up, a non-profit part of Google, building the largest digital record of global history, the largest, it has to be the largest for Google, by recording and hosting historic artifacts such as first-person accounts, photos, documents, and much more. And I don't actually have to read the rest because they're all doing the same thing. They're actually competing with each other for this content. And in some cases, they're setting up different interfaces and they're setting up different content standards. But nevertheless, what the objective is to try and encourage an economy, a creative economy, encourage us to engage with it, and perhaps usefully build some tools that we can all use. So we're waiting to see what happens with that. But this leads to another problem. Another problem is scale and quality. So these are aggregators trying to bring together lots of cultural heritage data. The technology itself allows large-scale cooperation, but actually you start getting into data quality issues as well. So Europeana is one of the developed aggregators that is suffering from this. Comes back to some of our concerns about releasing data. So if we don't release all of our data, we're nervous about open access, and that's going to be reflected in the aggregators. And that's sort of reflected in the results that Europeana has. And the Europeana portal itself is mostly used by general audience. Very, very few researchers and scholars use Europeana, despite the millions and millions and millions of pounds that have been put into it and are still going into it. So we can only hope that things change. But there's also issues about the cost and sustainability. So what if Europeana runs out of funding after 2015 when its funding runs out? What happens to all the stuff that we put into it? What happens to all the enriching projects? What happens to that data? And that relates to another issue about how we preserve data and how all of these aggregators link to our own institutional frameworks. And I think this is a big issue. So then I did say that this was a pessimistic part of the presentation. So problem number 3, if 2 weren't enough, it's actually really difficult to do projects with technology. And it's really difficult to do collaboration projects with technology. There's a quote there from John Unsworth. In the collaborative model, one works in conjunction with others, jointly producing scholarship that cannot be attributed to a single author. And I think that will also be very difficult for some academic departments. Digital projects cannot be done by one person. They're cross-discipline and they are teamwork. And so it's very difficult to point to the piece of work that you've actually done within it. Project management becomes more difficult with technology as well. There's a quote from King's in a report that was done for the Andrew Mellon Foundation that planning communication are essential factors in making a collaborative project a success. Technology makes project management skills even more of a premium. And you can see there in the next quote that a lot of digital humanities projects come across technical issues which push their timescales back. And I suspect that's something that they've all had experience about, IT projects sort of slipping and slipping and slipping. And then when they slip, the pressure of delivery takes over, and they stop being collaborative. So the pressure of delivery, the pressure of meeting your budget, the pressure of meeting your timescale means that effectively you're squeezing out the collaboration in order to get the project done. So formal collaboration projects can end up not being collaborative at all, and can end up in lots of fights, and that's the last quote from Lisa Terrace. So some organisations have tried to do something about this, and there are centres of digital humanities now that have tried to sort out some of the project management issues. They've put in frameworks, they're putting cross-disciplinary teams. They have the people who know the technology, they have the humanities people, they have the project managers. But even in these centres, collaboration is limited. Centres have overlapping agendas and activities, particularly in training, digitization of collections and metadata development, redundant activities across centres, or inefficient use of scarce resources available to the humanities community. This was the conclusion of Diane Zorich in a survey in 2008. Effectively, they're inward-looking, and they're not dealing with some of the big data issues. And this leads to the next problem of criticism of the digital humanities. And this is an article that came out quite recently in the Times Higher Education. The internet has revolutionized humanities research, but has the development of ever more sophisticated online resources freed up scholars to explore new ideas, or made themselves slaves to the digital machine? And I think others will be asking similar questions. So that concludes the pessimistic part of the presentation. I've got some positive news as well. Scholarly tools. Lots of projects have produced some really good scholarly tools. This one you might not be able to make out, but it's the bottom bit here is a tool that is a plug-in to Firefox. It's called Zotero. It's a bibliographic tool for citations. It allows you to put in notes and tags. It automatically takes bibliographic information from web pages. It allows you to annotate the web pages. Extremely useful. And there is a British Museum project that uses this one tool as the core infrastructure for their collaboration with other organisations. So they're actually using it as the core project database. Unfortunately, I don't know whether museums are still necessary because there was a paywall there and I couldn't get past that. So I've only got a record of the web page. If anybody's actually read that, I'd be interested in knowing what the conclusion was. Some other really positive initiatives as well. This is one from the digital classicists. Someone was talking about wikis this morning. And this is an extremely good wiki. It's decentralized. So there's none of the formalities that you have in some of the formal projects I was talking about. Not owned by any institution, no core funding, no formal executive, open to everyone, regardless of the skills and experience. It's not closed off to just the scholarly experts. And it is highly successful, and a number of projects have been spawned from this environment. It's sustained by the motivation and commitment and love of the subject of the people who actually use it. And an example, and there are some issues about the scholarly aspect of it, and this is a quote from Simon Mahoney, who's one of those digital classicists who's helped set up this wiki. He says, the open nature of the wiki is one of the great strengths of the wiki, but also one of the greatest obstacles to its scholarly use. And someone this morning was talking about scholarly citation. But actually, the benefits of open access outweigh arguments regarding its ability to act as a citable resource. And what its main benefit is to bring people together and actually help spawn new projects that people are actually interested in doing. And so therefore it has a very valuable place in the digital classicists world. And one of the projects that actually is spawned from that group is something called Plugius. It's bringing together data sets which describe the ancient world, ancient places, annotations on geographical places in the ancient world. And I just wanted to highlight this because it brings me into the subject of linked data and the semantic web. So instead of aggregating data, this project is simply aligning data from different data sets. And these little circles up here represent data sets with different sizes of database. And the purpose isn't to aggregate them all into a central repository. It's designed to actually align some of these data sets so they can build applications on top of them. So the data itself is still being maintained by the institution, but it's simply published in such a way that it looks like to the rest of the world a single database. And you can see here that you can put in a place, and it'll tell you where the resources are that you can go to look at the data about it. But more than that, because it's using linked data, you can actually produce some really interesting applications. This is the linked data that they're using, and all it is an adherence to some publishing standards. So up here you have some ontologies. This is friend of a friend, which is describing some ontology about relationships between data. This is geo. It's an ontology about geographical locations, and you can see that it has some vocabulary around longitude and latitude. SCOS is a terminology ontology, and it's used down here to give some archaic and modern names to label the resource. And it's all based around this permanent URI. This is a data URI. It doesn't refer to a particular page, although if you put it into a browser, it will give you a human-readable form of it. It refers to a thing about Athens, a piece of data about Athens. And by aligning everybody, so if everybody publishes using these ontologies and brings them together, you can start putting together applications that treat all of that data as if it's coming from one single database. And this is what linked data is all about. And this is one of the applications that has been produced as a result of that linked data. This is a plugin that anybody can use. You don't have to be a partner in the project. You can plug this into your own website. You create a link for a place name in your website, and when people hover over it, this appears and it tells you the resources around that agent place that you've linked to, and different resources come up depending on what you're linking to. And anybody can put this into their website. So coming now then to the research-based project. The research-based project, which is funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, I'm very grateful for their support, is about bringing all of those elements that I've just been talking to you about in one environment. So the tools like Zotero, in conjunction with the wiki that we saw from the digital classicists, in conjunction with harmonizing data, with linked data, as they're doing in the Pelagius project. And it's about bringing those all into one environment so that all those things talk to each other. So the data is available in the collaboration environment, and tools are available to analyze the data, and they all work over each other. And that's essentially what the research space project is all about, and it's using linked data as the harmonizing data process underlying it. And also it's interested in institutionalizing the data. So again, it's not interested in aggregating these big central repositories and silos and competing with other people. It's about importing to do a project. So if you've got a particular project, we'll provide the tools to map to an ontology that we're using on ResearchBase quickly and easily. The projects themselves are just traditional projects, but using that technology in that online environment, enriching that data, adding to it, and I'll show you a few screens that are related to that. And then when it's finished and it's published, being able to, allowing institutions to pull that data out again and bring it back into their institutions if they want to, but also making it available to the wider public who can produce their own applications if they want to as well. So it's serving both institutions and the general audience who want to make something out of this data. And in order to do this, we need to use more complicated ontologies. So the ontologies that I was talking about with Pelagius don't really fit into something like ResearchBase, where we're wanting to ask more complex questions, and we're wanting to bring together data such that we can infer new knowledge from it. So the idea about ResearchBase is that if you bring big data sets together and you do it in sufficient granularity, snippets of information within different data sets can come together and infer new knowledge. And this is what, again, ResearchBase is about. It's about data modeling. It's about using reasoning and inference and semantic web technologies to unearth information that you would never have been able to get in the data silos that you've got at the moment. This is available if you want to look at it. I just wanted to give you an idea of the granularity that we're actually mapping this data to in terms of the CDOC CRM ontology. CDOC CRM is a ontology that's appropriate for the cultural heritage sector. But if you look at it in detail, it's simply snippets of the same sorts of things that you saw when you were looking at the Pelagius linked data page. And when you look at some of these relationships that are embedded in that diagram, you can see them here. You can see how detailed they are. So we're going down to the level, these are the relationships that link pieces of data together. And these are the things that give us the granularity and allow us to infer information from different data sets. And of course, that's quite complicated. And one of the issues with that is once we've done it, once we've mapped all of this data, once you've got it into a very detailed data set, a detailed ontology, how do you then put it out to the users, and how do you put it in a form that the users can use and understand and make it easy to search for the data that they want to get hold of? So once we've done that mapping, and once we've brought data together, we're then producing some user-based tools, some non-technical tools that people can use. And this is an illustration of the search screen that will be used in ResearchBase. It's being developed at the moment. You can see here that we're creating a search sentence. We're bringing together information about the art history data set. But here, what we've done is aggregated some of those really complicated relationships into some simple relationships that people can understand. So we've gone through the process of putting the granularity in, and then we've aggregated those relationships into common terms that people can use to explore the data. And you can keep on changing these relationships and getting out new results, and this becomes a very good exploring tool for exploring different data sets. It doesn't need to be art history. You can combine art history with other disciplines, and you can use subjects within pictures to link out with other object types as well. But these are the sorts of tools that we want to give to end users to get rid of the complexity that we've put in, to put the infrastructure in the first place, but then we want people to be able to use the technology in a very simple and well thought out way. And this is another screen from ResearchBase. So this is an annotation application. And down here we've got the fields that are related to a particular object, and we can put in new annotations against either the fields or the relationships on the fields or the object record itself. So we're allowing people to say, right, this is an institutional record, it's from the RKD. You can put in, if you disagree with the data in it, you can put a new version of the data. And it's recorded against the institutional URI. So it's completely linked to the institutional record. But you, as a scholar, can put a new version of data, and you can put a comment in to say why you think that institutional data is wrong. You can also put in an annotation that links together fields on different records, and you can also put in just general comments. And what it's then meant to do is combine into a more of a collaborative conversation. So this is the bottom half of that screen. So those annotations are going into a widget here. And actually you're allowed to reply to them. So you can start a conversation around one of the annotations. And if you want, you can promote one of these annotations into a full discussion forum or a full research question. So you've gone from a level of the object, commenting on the object and putting notes on the object. But if something really interesting comes out, you can promote it to a top-level research question and start exploring another avenue of your research project. And this is, again, it's exactly the same idea, but with images. ResearchBase will be producing other tools as well, but we're at the moment concentrating on annotation tools. But you can see here that you're allowed to start putting regions around elements of an image. And again, the same annotation style applies. You can annotate those images, and people can then start replying and having a conversation about those annotations, or creating their annotations themselves. So where is this type of technology going to be used? We hope it will be used over a large number of different object types, but also in different sectors as well. So there's no reason why a lot of this technology couldn't be used in the natural history world and the tools produced to specific natural history projects. And I just wanted to go over a project which is being considered at the moment. There's a project between the Natural History Museum, the British Museum, and the British Library called Reconstructing Sloan. And it's sort of based on a concept that is around the Enlightenment Gallery that already exists in the British Museum. So the Enlightenment Gallery at the British Museum is a highly collaborative permanent fixture at the museum. It consists of objects that come from different museums, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, the British Library. And what it does is it organises objects according to the way that they were classified in the 18th century by the 18th century collectors. And I was talking to the curator of that gallery, and they were saying that there was no way that they could do a search on our collection management systems to bring back results that reflected what was in this gallery, because we're sitting natural and artificial objects together. So if you wanted to find out what was in this gallery, you'd have to go back to the provenance information and see who gave us the objects in order to bring it back together. This is a very manual task of putting this gallery together. And the links between the objects are about development over time. They're about development over periods and over cultures. They're not classified in the same way that we classify things in the modern world. And this is exactly where semantic technology can really help, because semantic technology can bridge relationships between different object types, between different themes, between different subjects and cultures, and bring those objects together. So although we can't do a digital search to bring together the Enlightenment Gallery on our screens, semantic data may actually be able to help us do that in the future. And this is just to reinforce the fact that we're attempting this, and I think I'm suggesting that semantic technology is probably the way to go forward in order to achieve a project like this. But I want to go back to the original slide as well, that it's not all about technology, it's about people as well, and we need to bring people along when we're introducing this technology. Thank you. Are there any questions? Thank you.
Hi. The general things that my colleagues have said, I completely agree with. In fact, I have a wonderful moment coming up where I'm going to show you a slide that is identical to a slide that Ken showed you. But for a second wonderful moment, we won't spend very much time on it. I'm supposed to talk about digital preservation. And I'll use that phrase, and I'll even talk about something called sustainable digital preservation. I have to say that when people talk about digital preservation, what I imagine is putting one's fingers into a cast or something and then mummifying the fingers, and then you've got preserved digits. But obviously that's not exactly what I'm supposed to talk about, which is good because I don't know anything about it. Meg said I should talk about what's involved in preserving digital or digitized things. I know a little bit about that. Whether what I have to say makes sense in the context of natural history collections is for you to tell me. I don't know much about natural history collections except that I'm a natural history museum junkie. I was raised by my grandmother at the American Museum of Natural History. We occasionally also spent some time in her house. But mostly we went to the American Museum of Natural History because it was more entertaining. And I actually discovered there that I didn't know this was going to happen to me. This was, 60-some years ago. I was a metadata junkie. So there'd be this great stuff, and I'd be reading the little plaque on the side. I was interested. Where did it come from? What was it called? And then, of course, even since I've been going to the American Museum of Natural History for 60 years, I've gotten to see changes in what things were called, right? The Latin names of things changed. Do you realize you guys do that? Do you have any idea how horrible that is for somebody who's out there believing that there's some stability to science? Thanks a lot. My other experience of natural history museums is that I've been a university administrator in various contexts at various times. And on the very first day that I was a member of the executive committee of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts at the University of Michigan, somebody came in with a binder about this thick and said, now we're going to talk about the herbarium. I didn't know, I have to confess, what a herbarium was. And the notion that we had such a thing, and it was as rich and powerful a tool for research, and that there was a field called systematics that was named that way differently than all the other things that I'd thought of as being systematic in my life, was wonderful and exciting news. So I actually went and hung out at the herbarium a little bit, discovered a little bit of what they did, and it was fun. But enough we've now exhausted my natural history knowledge. So I'm going to start with the proposition that we are interested in digitization and digitized versions of things in 2 or 3 or 4 dimensions, because things happen over time, or if we want to do string theory on these collections more, I'm not quite sure how that would work. And what I think some of the things I'm going to say that I've learned from the world of libraries and publishing about digital preservation will indeed carry over in useful ways. We'll see that the digital is different. All right, that's going to be theme number 1. We'll keep coming back to it, maybe the only theme. And we depend on digital information for lots of things, and we don't even bother to notice, but now we have to, that access to information tomorrow, here we are in the 4 dimensions, requires preservation today. And of course, I really say of course, I'm saying something that Ken said very clearly. Mostly this is a technical, management, policy, regulatory, social, and economic problem. The technical part is actually, I won't say it's the easy part, but you can imagine how it would be solved, as long as you don't go around changing the Latin names of things. But the policy, regulatory, social, and economic parts are the more difficult ones. So we keep asking ourselves, what should be preserved, who's responsible, who pays for it, and for the supporting infrastructure and cyber infrastructure so that things can be used interoperably in the way that Dominic talked about. I mean, that's the exciting stuff, right? It really changes the way you can do science. It changes the way you can do humanities. And that's what we want, as well as the notion that was proposed in the earlier session, that we can increase access to things without damaging the objects, which is also extremely cool. And those of us in the book world like that idea too. If I press a button, does something happen? Yes, it does. So Alexander Ruthven was a president of the University of Michigan and also ran various museums there. I think that statement has to be true, at least in some form. You could say the same thing about libraries instead of museums there. That'll work. You can say the same thing about universities. That'd work. So, I mean, you could even say, I don't know, families. Well, at least mine, but most maybe not. Maybe they did some other things too. There are lots of good entities, right, that are interested in these sets of problems, not museums alone. But there's a really important sense for museums, applies to books too, I think, which is that the knowledge that we're trying to increase and then diffuse out there into the world is stored in some way in the objects and in their associated metadata. So there's a lot of news in a specimen and the card next to it that says where it came from and the chemical analysis that's been done on it and so on and so forth. The object stores knowledge that we care about. We have to preserve the thing in order to make that happen. There is an infinite literature, well, probably not infinite, a really, really, really big finite literature on how to preserve things that you all know about that I don't. There's a really, really, really big finite literature on how to preserve books. And basically, the notion is that handle with care and don't overuse, keep in a climate where it doesn't rot too quickly, is a lot of what it comes down to. And you often have to prepare the object in order to be preserved well. And there's something that we sometimes forget, which is that preservation always requires a continuing flow of resources to take care of the thing. If you just let it sit there, and there is an unheated space, right, without good climate control, where anybody who wants to can walk by and do something, eventually the thing's actually going to disappear on you. We sometimes forget that, especially in the library world about books, because some past provost already kindly built the damn building that we're keeping the books in, and so we don't think it costs anything to keep the books there anymore. Some people, I don't know if the same thing happens to the herbarium, but actually if I look at the herbarium at Michigan and how the director of it at the time thought about it, he really didn't care about the space costs as such. That was in some other budget, right? And in fact, those costs of keeping things range from not trivial to huge for almost anything that you might care about. But the second thing, so we have to preserve the thing. Why do we preserve it? Well, we love to preserve things because we're museum and library people, but almost everybody else preserves things because they want to have access to it. They want to be able to use it. They want to be able to pull that knowledge out of the thing, and that's really what, if you can't sell the access part, you're very unlikely to get resources for the preservation. So you have to have the thing in order to make use of it. That sounds like it's obvious, but that's actually the first place that we're going to find where digital is really different. So how is digital different? Well, there are physical differences that matter. Books actually don't mind being read too much, but they do mind being read too much. You read a book enough times, it goes bad on you. And time is also not very good for books if they were printed on acid paper, which a great many of them were. We often have lots of copies of books, which is a helper. Museum stuff, it seems to me, doesn't love being handled, mostly. Electronic resources love being handled. They love being used. It makes them feel good, and it makes it possible for us to tell whether they are the thing that they say that they are. Because if you don't check frequently, check sums, check bits, right, all that stuff, they turn out to become something else. And they turn out to be in a format you can't read, and all sorts of other stuff happens to them. If you use them all the time, you can actually keep track of what they are. That's actually a really big difference. There's a second really big difference, which is very clear in the world of books. It is impossible for a library that is made up of print collections to provide access without also providing preservation. Right? A patron comes to the library and says, I'd like to read this book. If the patron is a distinguished professor of, zoology, you damn well better have it if you're the university librarian. You actually have to have it, right? The book itself, which stores the information that you care about that the professor of zoology wants to have. There's no way in the print world to provide access without having continuously preserved the object that you're providing access to. Everybody's saying, well, yeah, that's obvious, but wait, in the digital world, it's trivial. In fact, it's ubiquitous that we provide access to things that we have absolutely no model, business or otherwise, to preserve. So you go to the library's website and you pull up an article from a journal that the library has subscribed to on your behalf, and it's not there. Why isn't it there? It's actually not the library's fault. The library signed a contract with the publisher. The publisher said, this journal's going to be there. Here's the money, here's the journal. Oh, the journal's website went down. Yeah, maybe it comes back up again, maybe it doesn't. The journal was sold to a different aggregator of journals who decided that this journal wasn't very interesting anymore, and nobody paid attention to the back files. This happens. It happens frequently, and there's nothing in the system that prevents it from happening the way it was with books. So the books carried around their information. You had to preserve them in order to be able to deliver. Now you write a contract with somebody who, and you don't own the journal, you don't own lots of ebooks, you lease them under various rules, and the long-term preservation of those things in the digital world may or may not be taken care of by a set of institutions. Probably not relevant to sort of original specimens and copies, but once you get into the business of using the powerful digital tools to start doing research on files that describe well, that are good simulacra of the originals, and you get used to being able to go someplace to find something, and there's some entity that is pulling these together, aggregating them in an interesting way, and one Tuesday morning they're not there, right? That is going to be a problem, I think, that can face your world as well as mine. So preservation and access get unlinked in the digital world. Where am I? I'm going the wrong way. Let's make progress. So here's a different version. This is a 9th century clay container excavated in Peru. It's been scanned in 3 dimensions, right? And we actually have a printer that will print it in 3 dimensions. Way far cool, right? So this actually allows us to preserve, right, and also to provide access to the thing in a way that we never have before. My own paranoid fears for things like this is somebody, some board of trustees, some private museum, somebody is going to copyright the files. Of course, the object can't be copyrighted. It's 1,200 years old. But they're going to copyright the files, or maybe they won't copyright the files, but there'll be a whole set of rights issues around being able to use the digitized versions of 3-dimensional objects that could make it difficult to use them when we would prefer, I think, to make it easy. And then we have the access version here. The library is actually not sitting on that iPhone, but the library catalog is. And it won't be very long before the parts of the library that can be legitimately made available to a user actually will be available through an object approximately the size of that iPhone, which is an amazing business. And we can clearly get to 3-dimensional pictures, and it won't be too long before you'll be able to take something like that iPhone and hook it up to the handy 3D printer, which is down the hall or at Kinko's or in the museum, and print out your objects. So that's as I said, kind of cool. The problem again is the digital versions can fall apart, can be lost, can change format, can suffer from all of these kinds of problems. You know, the physical things obviously can suffer from versions of those problems too, but you actually have a pretty good idea that if you put the dead bird in a drawer and you pull the drawer out again, that's still there, still dead, still the same bird. Okay. Whoops, wrong direction. You've seen this slide before. So, you know, and what Ken said about it is exactly right. There's 1 million of these out there, and they are all approximately the same. And often what people use this kind of picture for, is to put costs on all of the pieces, But of course, how each part of it is done, if we think about this life cycle of digital preservation, affects the cost of the other pieces. If things are prepared well, it's cheaper to do things down the road. If things are prepared well, it's more expensive to do things now. And of course, we don't really know with any kind of certainty which things we're going to want to have taken good care of 50 years from now. The answer, let's take good care of it all, is the kind of thing that makes provosts fall over. And also, they won't give you the money for it, even if they don't fall over. And then there's bit rot. But anyhow, there's this kind of picture, and then this is another version of the same story. And this is useful. You just go through, you make long lists of all the things you have to do in order to preserve something. And then you ask yourself, how do you bring the resources to it that will allow that to happen? This slide comes from a group at the University of California Curation Center and the California Digital Library, and they're worrying a lot about what kinds of resource streams of payments are necessary in order to support a model like this. All of these lists are slightly different. They're all fundamentally similar. Our estimates of what the costs are invariably terrible, because all we can do is estimate what the costs are with today's technology and the way in which we use today's technology. And mostly we get better at that, so the costs ought to go down, but then we dream up new higher levels of functionality than we've ever dreamed up before, and so the cost goes up, and so it's who knows. The question, what will it cost to keep a digital copy of for the next 100 years, is a question I can answer at the level of, I have a technology that'll get that job done for you. It'll cost X. What will it actually cost? Who knows? That also is hard on provosts. So I was on a task force that studied some of these problems, and I looked at the report before putting this talk together. It's pretty good. And rather than go into any kind of detail on it, I'm just going to commend it to you. I think it's pretty good. There's lots of relevant information for thinking about the problems of sustainability and problems of digitization, and I'm just going to pull a few of the highlights out of the report, and also a few of the highlights that come from having been a professional economist for 40 years. And you got to admit, it's wonderful that somebody who's been a professional economist for 40 years views his life as being one of highlights, right? This is the optimism of the academic. There in a nutshell is sustainability and not. So the waterfall on the left is behaving well and basically replenishes, you can predict, although everything will be different every time, it'll be about the same if all of the stuff that's happening upstream is about the same, which of course it may not be. And the second case, which is a broken dam, that flow is not sustainable. But if what you're interested in is a lot of water in a hurry, it's a great thing. And we often build stuff that looks like the broken dam, and then wonder how we're going to bring resources to it in order to hold on to it over the long run. Here, I'm going to violate principles of university fundraising and say what we think of as the gold standard for sustainability in terms of bringing resources to things is to endow them, right? They get an endowment, and the endowment throws off enough money approximately forever. It's a little tricky right now with the interest rate being zero and all, but we don't think that the interest rate's going to stay zero. And it's enough to keep the stuff you've got, pay the staff, and then have a budget for cool, interesting new projects every year. I claim that as a general matter, that's too much money to give to the enterprise, whatever the enterprise might be. That in fact, we should be interested in there being markers of ongoing demand for what the thing might be. If you endow something today, it may really be that you're stuck with having that thing 50 years from now when it's not of much interest to anybody, and it turns out you endowed the one at Yale, and pretty much if there is one endowed someplace, Yale's a good candidate to have it. And they endowed one at Harvard, and they endowed one even, they wouldn't have endowed it at Michigan, that's just not what we do. They endowed one at Stanford, and they endowed one at Princeton, and they endowed 4 of them at Oxford, but only 3 of them are actually known to the people at Oxford. And it turns out that in the digital world, in the world where you can move things around quickly, in the world where you can do 3D printing, in the world that we're talking about now, you don't need that many of them to do those things. If you had instead put some more room, made people sing a little bit more for their supper, not much, because I really do think we should have ways to hold on to things for a long time before we decide to abandon them, you actually might get a much more efficient allocation of resources over time than pure endowment. So I like the idea of raising a lot of money for something that's important and having it, be good enough to keep the thing running for a decade or two. And then there's some buildings and things. And then you keep bringing new resources to it. By the way, that's the way all of our systems basically run. It's not as if things are that well endowed. There's annual fundraising, there's projects, there's grants, there's tuition in the university world, et cetera. And that strikes me as a better way to do it. So this is all from the report and starts talking a little bit about the organizational issues and is not, in my view, fascinating. But the bottom one, mechanisms to assure an ongoing efficient allocation of resources to digital preservation activities, that's the piece that is actually essential. And those mechanisms crucially include what I would call handoffs. So you've got something, you think it's valuable, the ownership structure is changing for some reason, right? The something was sitting not necessarily in a public entity, or the public entity it was sitting in goes broke, right? How do you make sure that we make the social decision whether or not to keep it without throwing it away? And that is a problem that in the digital world can present itself and get resolved, and resolved unhappily like that. In the physical world, it takes a little more time because it takes time for things to disappear on you. And I think this is another way in which digital is different. This is just if I had the perfect slide here, I'd show it to you, but I don't. So, and there we go. So these again come out of the report. They're, I think, essentially self-explanatory, and I'm keeping you away from lunch, and I'm really deeply hoping that someone will ask a question, so I want to get to the end of the talk to find out if I can make that happen. The big one here is the difficulty of separating preservation costs from other costs. The misalignment of incentives between who owns something and who's going to care about it 50 years from now, that's actually familiar to all of us. And is very consequential, again, in the digital world, because it's so easy to have things disappear on you. Okay, that's boring, too. I'm going to find an interesting slide here if it kills me. Concluding thoughts. That must be exciting. Preservation decisions are always made under conditions of uncertainty. We don't know what the technology is going to be. We don't know what the policy environment is going to be, right? Copyright law is going to change, patent law is going to change, that'll matter. Their social interests move around. We don't know. So the key thing, it seems to me, is to not do things that are irreversible until you have to, right? Again, this notion of handoffs, I think, is really very important. If you can't preserve it, can you have time to find someone who might want to? If it's at risk for not being preserved because it's held by some place that isn't the kind of institution that cares about preservation per se, do you get to see it, to have an opportunity to bid on it, if you will, again, before it disappears? And then here is a big problem, that commitments, even so, the commitments we make can't be, except in this pure endowment model, which is too pricey, commitments for all time. So again, what we're interested in is flexibility, and then my favorite recent quote that I ran across, which covers most of the issues that I've been talking about today, and actually most of the issues that I face as a university librarian. And here I want to go back to a theme that both Ken and Dominic talked about. if we're going to organize ourselves, the good to which we are organizing ourselves here is the good of making things open, interoperable, easily usable, approximately forever. Because actually, if they're open and interoperable and easily usable, there'll be lots of copies around there. They'll get used. They'll get taken out and exercised in the formats of the day. Many of the risks that I've been talking about today won't happen. Thank you. Questions? See, it says questions right there. Ah, well. You got one? All right.
Yeah. I was a graduate student in the University of Michigan Herbarium, so I'm glad you got to know it. So if endowments aren't the answer, which I was beginning to think that they were, the periodic scrambling for money seems to be the other alternative, or is there another one?
So I would do something in between. The question was if endowments aren't the answer, and periodic scrambling for money isn't the answer either, and we all know how much fun periodic scrambling for money is. So I'm an in-betweener. I want to endow things so that they will go for 20 years or 30 years, and we know when we're going to run out of this lump. So we raise money for the thing, and it acts like endowment. It throws off interest. It just isn't. We shouldn't limit ourselves, I think, to only doing the set of things that will be supported with the endowment. We should spend it more rapidly than that, believing that we will generate things that are of value, and that value shows up in grants, in various other kinds of activities, so that we can expand the enterprise. There may be some things that are so important, so valuable, so unique, that can't be English, that you really do want to endow them so that you can hold them for as long as the monetary system you've endowed them in holds together. This is working out well in Greece, isn't it? But most things that I think academics and scholars and cultural heritage institutions do, we should be more ambitious than settling for the rate of return on endowment as being the set of activities that we can support. But we shouldn't be at the mercy of an annual budget cycle. That's also not the right place to be, and I think there actually is a substantial in between.
Okay. I was wondering if you could speak to the interaction of analog preservation sort of departments and digital preservation, because I would argue that sometimes it's not so easy as sticking a dead bird in a drawer, and there are life cycle models in analog preservation that I think the collaboration is not always happening between preservation administration and digital preservation.
So it's not always as easy as putting the bird in the drawer. That was a bad example. I apologize. And it's certainly not always as easy as putting a book on a shelf, which is the world that I come from. It would be very useful if the physical preservers and the digital preservers spent more time talking about their common interests, because this notion of the life cycle isn't especially digital. Actually, it applies to all sorts of things. There are important technical differences. There are things that can go wrong with digital that can't go wrong with analog. There are things that go wrong with digital easily, like it gets separated from its own metadata, that can go wrong with analog, but it happens less often because we have a physical thing, which makes it easier. At the University of Michigan, we have a digital preservation librarian now living in the Conservation and Preservation Unit, and it's okay. They talk to each other. They know they're in the same business. And I'm hoping to get more out of that. There's another place where you can get a better match, which is for many physical objects, the 3D scanning and printing actually becomes a form of preservation. It's not complete. You're obviously not preserving the original there, except by making it less needed for lots of purposes. So I think this is a place where what you want to do is get people together who think they're in the preservation business, think they're therefore ultimately in the access business, and who are not snooty about the value of their own work relative to the others. In fact, as a longtime university administrator, if you can remove some of the sense of snootiness that we each have about our own particular areas, things get a whole lot better. Just one more, and then we really probably are out of time, but I feel very good about having gotten questions.
Okay. Thank you for the amusing talk. My question is, are we prepared for a change in technology? And if so, when do you foresee that it's going to occur?
So the question was, are we prepared for change in technology? And the answer is, well, absolutely, and of course not. So we ought to be. I mean, so technology is changing rapidly. The things that you can do, and this is the demand side again, changes rapidly. And as the next generations of scholars, and for that matter, museum goers and library users, see in their ordinary daily lives cool stuff that they can do in other parts of the world, they will insist that they be able to do those cool things in our parts of the world too. And if we don't deliver, they're actually going to not support us well. So again, my argument that we need to have ongoing demand for the kinds of activities, realized demand for the kind of activities we do in order for them to prosper, I think is right. And so we'd better be open to responding to those technical changes with the built-in conservatism that comes with the academy. So we shouldn't be jumping to the fad of the hour. I'm actually rather hopeful about that mostly, except that I think there are these cases of drop stitches, as in the digital world, where you can simply lose access to stuff you thought you had access to because you actually didn't own it. But again, going back to the kinds of things Dominic was talking about, there's real technical change, deep technical change underneath that set of activities that will in turn change the way we do our work, which will in turn change the way that we collect and preserve, and openness to that, and not thinking that that is a threat to cool old things, whether or not they're in drawers, I think is an important piece of getting it done right. Thank you all.
Okay. Just a couple of, I just wanted to end the plenary session by saying that I think that Paul summed it up perfectly when he said we're all in the access business. And our three speakers spent a lot of time talking about enormous cultural, technical, economic, and policy challenges that we've all been working with. But I think that the other side of these talks has been that we were at this extraordinarily exciting and much waited for moment in time in which the fruits of our work are beginning to show in new ways of doing humanities and science research, and in fact, opening up the content to a broader community even beyond the academy, and that is why we're managing the life cycle in the first place. So please join me in thanking our plenary speakers one more time, and enjoy your lunch.